So let's just jump right into this explainer. We're looking at something today that literally affects almost every single one of us every single day. The gap between our totally normal daily lives and the sheer weight of the entire globe. We're going to take our time with this, look at it calmly, curiously, and with absolutely no drama. I mean, have you ever noticed this? You wake up, you grab your morning coffee, maybe your commute is a breeze, and hanging out with your friends is perfectly fine. Your own personal day? Totally okay. And yet, humming right there in the background, there's this heavy, looming sense that everything, everywhere, is just falling apart. Why does the world feel like it's collapsing when your immediate surroundings are safe? Let's figure that out. Okay, to be completely upfront, the world has real problems, real ones. This is definitely not an explainer telling you everything is perfectly fine and there's nothing to worry about, because that just wouldn't be true. Instead, we're focusing on the mechanics of what a normal, healthy human brain does when you hand it the entire planet at once through a glowing screen. We're asking a whole lot of our minds right now. Now, what's really fascinating here is a massive study published in Nature Human Behavior. They ran randomized tests on 370 million views of real news headlines just to see what actually drives our attention. And our research suggests something totally counterintuitive. Positive words were actually more common in the headline database, about 2.83% compared to 2.62% for negative words. Think about that. The negativity was literally the smaller pile of information, but we walked toward it anyway. It wasn't the bulk of the content, but it was exactly what drew our eyes. So the crucial point is how our attention shifted when we saw those negative words. The research suggests that each extra negative word raised the click-through rate by only about 2.3% on an average headline. That is a small effect. Actually, it's really quite small. We're not talking about some massive, overwhelming manipulation here. It's just a tiny, consistent human bias. But it's an effect that stayed incredibly consistent across a massive amount of data. And this brilliantly illustrates the flip side of that behavior. Each positive word actually lowered the click-through rate by about 1% on an average headline. It's kind of wild when you think about it. Given the choice on a massive scale across hundreds of millions of views, we consistently stepped away from the positive and just leaned a tiny bit toward the negative. But here is where the researchers got surprised. And honestly, this part matters way more than the main finding. We usually assume we're just purely driven by outrage, right? Well, anger words showed absolutely no significant effect on clicks. None. People didn't flock to headlines just because they were angry. The data paints a much calmer story about what we actually do. Even more surprisingly, fear words went the exact opposite direction from what the team predicted before they started. We were actually less likely to click on headlines that used specific fear-based language. When a headline actively tried to frighten, readers tended to back away instead of clicking. Furthermore, the author specifically warned that a person clicking a negative headline does not necessarily mean they felt worse while reading it. Sometimes we're just gathering facts. So, just to be super clear, anger didn't drive clicks, fear went backwards, and clicking doesn't equal suffering. When you lay those three things out loud, it gives us a much more complex and maybe even hopeful picture of how our minds work. So let's see how this builds into something called availability bias. This is essentially how your brain just does the math wrong, totally by accident. In plain words, the brain guesses how often something happens in the real world by how easily it can pull an example out of memory. If it's easy to remember, your brain just naturally assumes, oh, that must happen all the time. Think about how information gets delivered to us today. A loud, dramatic 30-second video clip, that is incredibly easy to remember. It's vivid, it's moving, it demands your attention. On the flip side, a quiet, reassuring statistical number is really not easy to remember. Our brains just aren't wired to hold on to dry data the same way they instantly grab onto vivid, moving pictures. And because of this mental shortcut, the brain simply writes down, I saw it a lot, as it happens a lot. If you see 4 different angles of the same rare event on your feed, your brain automatically assumes that event is everywhere. It completely distorts our view of reality. Not because we're broken, but because our memory systems are just trying to be efficient. Which brings us to a very human, very relatable response. Why can't we put our devices down when something scary is in the news? Why do we keep scrolling and searching when we know it's just making us tense? It's a question practically all of us have wrestled with. Well, one study found that when things feel uncertain during a stressful time, people look for information to feel back in control. And that is a totally normal, highly adaptive coping strategy. Usually, gathering facts helps us figure out what to do and makes us feel safer. You aren't spiraling because you want to feel bad. You're searching for a way to feel safe. But that strategy stops working when the uncertainty has no end, because no amount of reading actually finishes it. So the search just keeps going. And let's be totally honest here. Some researchers also think the endless design of our feeds does part of this, giving us no natural stopping point. That's a very reasonable idea. It hasn't really been tested yet, but it makes a lot of sense when you look at how endless the bottom of a screen actually feels. So, what does this all mean? The main takeaway is that the overwhelming feeling you have is completely real, but the perceived size of the threat is not always accurate. Those are two different things, and a person is allowed to hold both of them at once. You can respect your own emotional response while also gently reminding your brain that its math might just be a little bit off. So, the next time you feel the weight of the entire globe resting on your shoulders, ask yourself, is the world actually falling apart, or is your feed just doing the math wrong? You don't need to stop caring about the world. You need to understand what your brain can carry. And if this feels bigger than an explainer, that's okay. Talking to a real person helps.